On this episode of Black Girl Gone, I tell the story of Trellis Sykes, a 16-year-old girl who was murdered in Houston, Texas on May 13th, 1994. Trellis, who was a sophomore in high school, took a shortcut while walking to school that morning, a route that she took almost every day to school. But that morning, Trellis never made it to school. When she didn't return home that afternoon, her family discovered that no one had seen Trellis since she left home that morning. Her family reported her missing, but just a couple of hours later, Trellis's lifeless body was found in an abandoned lot, just a few feet from the path she had taken. She had been brutally murdered, but 30 years later, no one has been arrested for her murder. Who killed Trellis Sykes, and why? This is Trellis' story. It's been 30 years since 16-year-old Trellis Sykes was raped, murdered, and left in an abandoned field, and the person responsible for this brutal murder has never been found. The murder of this teenage girl is a story many people have never heard. In fact, there is very little information publicly available about what happened to Trellis. If it wasn't for the reporting done by ABC 13 reporter Courtney Fisher, I would have never stumbled across Trellis' story and her unsolved murder. Decades later, there are still many unanswered questions about what happened to her, but those close to her are determined to get answers and keep Trellis' memory alive. Trellis Sykes was born on January 19th, 1978 in Houston, Texas, to Robert and Gail Sykes. She was the eldest of three daughters in a tight-knit family residing in Sunnyside, a historically black neighborhood in Houston established in 1912. Sunnyside holds the distinction of being one of the oldest African-American communities in the United States, having been formed during the segregation era. For many years, Sunnyside thrived economically and socially. However, by the time Trellis and her siblings were growing up in the 1980s, the neighborhood had begun to experience decline. The area, once bustling with business and community activities, saw rising poverty and crime rates. Despite these challenges, however, the Sykes family remained deeply connected to their community, embodying the resilience and hope that once characterized Sunnyside's spirit. The Sykes family, despite the things facing their community, lived a life described by many as happy. Friends and neighbors often remarked on Trellis' quiet demeanor, paired with her vibrant personality, making her a joy to be around. The family's harmony was evident, and the children seemed to have a stable and joyful life. However, 1991 marked a tragic turning point for Trellis and her younger siblings. In July 1991, when Trellis was just 13 years old, their father Robert died suddenly from unknown causes. This loss was devastating for the family, leaving them reeling. But just a few months later, in December of that same year, their mother Gail succumbed to a brief illness, further shattering their world. The sudden loss of both parents within such a short span of time was a catastrophic blow to the Sykes children, leaving them orphaned and heartbroken. Following their parents' deaths, the Sykes siblings were separated to live with different relatives. Trellis went to live with her grandmother while her younger siblings were taken in by an aunt. This separation added another layer of hardship to an already overwhelming situation, as the sisters had to adjust to new homes and the absence of their once united family. The death of both of their parents, both mother and father, was very hard for the Sykes sisters, but their extended family did their best to provide them with a nurturing and supportive environment. Despite the profound loss, Trellis, from a young age, had remarkable resilience and excelled both academically and athletically. She became an honor student, known for her focus and dedication to her schoolwork. And Trellis also thrived as an athlete, running track, playing basketball, and volleyball. By the time Trellis was in high school, she had grown to 6 feet tall, and her friends and teammates began affectionately calling her Tree because she was taller than all the girls on her team. As a student at Worthing High School, Trellis continued to excel as both a student and an athlete, and she stood out as a basketball player. She was a force on the court, and those that watched her play knew that she was going places. Although only in her sophomore year of high school, Trellis was already making plans for her future and working on getting a scholarship for college. For her family, Trellis was their star, kind, talented, and ambitious. They were all looking forward to watching her grow into a successful young woman. But as Trellis's sophomore year came to an end, her life would be brutally taken away. May 13th, 1994 began as a normal day for Trellis. It was a Friday, and she was getting ready for the last day of school before the weekend. Trellis would usually walk to school or take the bus to Worthing, which was located about 2 miles from where she lived. At around 7:30 that morning, Trellis left her home to make her way to school. Her Aunt Pam, who lived with Trellis and her grandmother, said in an interview with ABC 13 that she would leave in the morning before Trellis to catch the bus to work, and everything about that morning was ordinary. After leaving her house on Alberta Street, Trellis began her walk. It was something she had done almost every day since becoming a student at Worthing. Now, the school was located nearly 2 miles from her house, but there was a shortcut that she and other students would take through some abandoned fields that would cut down the time it took to get to school or to the bus stop. Although the fields were unkept with 8 foot tall weeds in some places, residents and students in the area had created a path which you could use to travel back and forth. As Trellis walked to school that morning, she took that shortcut like she had done dozens of times, but this time was different. There was someone waiting for her, and Trellis never arrived at school. When she didn't come to school that day, Trellis's family was not notified, and so they had no idea that something was wrong until much later. Her Aunt Pam said that when she arrived home from work, she expected her niece to be there, but when she got there, Trellis was not home. Pam said that normally Trellis would have been home by the time she got off, and being the responsible, respectful girl that she was, Trellis was always where she was supposed to be. And if something had come up, she would have called and said that she was going to be late. Pam said that she asked her mom, Trellis's grandmother, if she knew where she was, but she didn't, and Trellis had not called her. Her aunt and grandmother knew something was off, but before they went into full panic, they decided to go to Worthing High to see if maybe she had stayed at school late and forgot to check in. But when Pam and her mother arrive at the school, they get the shocking news that Trellis never made it to school. It was unbelievable, and her family had not been notified about her absence. Had they not gone to the school, they would have never known that she had never made it there. But once they learned that Trellis had not shown up for school, they immediately knew that something was wrong. Pam was at a loss, overwhelmed with worry and uncertainty. She immediately contacted the Houston police to report Trellis missing, detailing every aspect of her last known whereabouts. As soon as the call was made, Pam and other family members jumped into their cars and began driving around the neighborhood, hoping to find any sign of Trellis. They went door to door, visiting friends and acquaintances, asking if anyone had seen or spoken to her. But each friend they visited, each door they knocked on, brought only more disappointment and concern because no one had any information about her whereabouts. As the minutes turned to hours, the anxiety among the family members grew. The streets of Sunnyside, usually familiar and somewhat comforting, now seemed ominous and scary. Pam and the rest of her family felt a growing sense of dread with each passing moment. But just a few hours after discovering that Trellis was missing, their search for her would come to a devastating end. At around 5:30 p.m., Houston police received a call from a person who reported discovering the body of a woman in an abandoned field off Bowen Street, the same field that Trellis had taken to school that day. Upon arriving at the scene, The police navigated through the dense vegetation and found the young woman's body hidden within the tall weeds, just a few feet from the makeshift path that cut through the lot. As the officers secured the area and began their investigation, it became clear that this young woman was the high school student that had been reported missing. The once familiar shortcut had now become a tragic landmark. The news of a body being found spread quickly through Sunnyside, and Pam, along with other family members, rushed to the scene. The realization that the lifeless body might belong to Trellis brought an overwhelming wave of sorrow and disbelief. The once hopeful search had now turned into a heart wrenching confirmation of their worst fears. Pam said that when they placed the body on a gurney so it could be taken to the medical examiner's office, that they could see a leg with a foot and a sneaker. And when they saw the sneaker, they immediately knew that they had found Trellis and their search had come to an unthinkable end. But while the search for Trellis had ended, the search for answers about what happened to her had only just begun. Trellis was just 16 years old and on her way to school. It was unimaginable that someone would murder her and leave her body in that field. But Trellis had been found. However, finding justice was going to take much longer. On May 13th, 1994, 16-year-old Trellis Sykes left her home to walk to school like she had done many times before. But after taking her normal shortcut, someone attacked Trellis, killing her and leaving her body in that abandoned field. After making the gruesome discovery, police now need to find out who killed her and why. After Trellis's body was found and her identity confirmed, the investigation into what happened to her began. But from the beginning, this investigation would prove difficult, and there was very little evidence at the scene. Back in 1994, DNA and other forensic tests were in their infancy, and many of the tools police now have at their disposal, they didn't have 30 years ago. But what investigators did know was that whoever had done this to Trellis was a monster. Detectives on the scene could immediately tell that it appeared that Trellis had been hit in the head with an object, and an autopsy later confirmed that Trellis had been hit in the back of the head. She was then raped before being strangled to death. But Trellis had not gone down easy. She had fought for her life. She had broken nails and defensive marks that told police that she had done everything in her power to get away from her attacker. But in the end, he got the best of the teenager. Because of the early morning hour that the murder took place, there was no one around to hear or see anything. Despite the path being one traveled by other people in the community, including other students, that morning, when Trellis took that shortcut to school, she was alone, and her attacker was lying in wait. When the autopsy was performed on Trellis, there was DNA taken off of her body, but the amount of DNA found was too small to be tested back in 1994, and so they could not create a profile of their suspect. Investigators turned to the community in hopes that they could lead them to some answers. Crime in the area had steadily been on the rise, and people in the area were well aware of the dangers that lurked in their neighborhood. But still, Trellis's brutal murder sent shockwaves throughout the Sunnyside community. Investigators spoke to neighbors and people in the community and were told that they knew that crossing the abandoned field could be dangerous. The field was on private property, but the residents had been asking the city of Houston for years to mow the weeds, but their requests had been ignored, allowing the lot to overgrow and become not only a nuisance, but now also a crime scene. As part of their investigation, detectives spoke to sex workers and drug dealers that the residents told them were known to use the lot for various activities, but they were unable to get anything useful from them. A week after Trellis's murder, her family held her funeral. It was packed with family and friends and community members who wanted to pay their respects and mourn the loss of this bright, talented girl. The loss was hard for her family. Both her parents had died just 3 years earlier, and now Trellis was gone. The Sykes had gone from a family of five to just two, leaving the youngest Sykes siblings without their parents or their big sister. Tragedy had ravaged this family, and in the aftermath of Trellis's murder, they were having a very hard time coping. Pam said that she did not leave the house for 2 months after Trellis's murder. Quote, "It was scary. We didn't know who this person was, and always everyone would say, 'Oh, Trellis looks just like you,' and that made me scared," Pam told ABC 13. Students at Worthing took Trellis's death hard also, and they too were scared. Many of them walked the same path that she did, and they knew that it could have been them. When you're a teenager and someone you know is murdered, it makes you face your own mortality in a way that you hadn't before. Quote, "School stopped. It really did. The students were so torn up about it, from ninth grade all the way through the 12th grade. They were sick about it. It was unbelievable this happened to one of them. Reality set in that this could well enough happen to them just like it happened to Trellis," former vice principal at Worthing, Ronnie Evans, said in his interview with ABC 13. As detectives continued their investigation, they began to talk more and more to people in the area, and they discovered that multiple women had been attacked and or raped in Sunnyside, and nothing was being done. In the 16 months before Trellis's murder, at least 11 other women were raped within miles of where Trellis was killed. The victims ranged in age from 12 to 30, and all of the victims had a very similar story. They would all describe a similar suspect, too. Same height description, same description of the sneakers he was wearing. The rumors that there was a serial rapist on the loose had been swirling for months, but with Trellis's murder, people were now living in fear that things would get much worse before someone was caught. In the weeks and months following Trellis's murder, detectives had attempted to follow several leads, but none of them had proven to be fruitful. In the wake of the murder, the lot where Trellis's life was taken was cut down thanks to local residents asking a team of city workers to help, but it was little solace for those who knew and loved Trellis. The case was going cold, and the more time that went by, the harder it was to find any information about the murder. In the beginning, both detectives and Trellis's family were sure that whoever had done this would be caught. But as those months turned to years, the hope that a killer or killers would be found faded. Now, while detectives had been looking for one suspect, Trellis's family believed that it was possible there were two people involved. At 6 feet tall and an athlete, Trellis was strong, and it was hard for them to imagine that one person could have done this to her. But sadly, there were no suspects emerging, and if there were any persons of interest, detectives never publicly named them. In the years after Trellis's murder, very little information came out about this crime or the investigation, and eventually, the case went completely cold. People in the Sunnyside community, however, never forgot Trellis or what happened to her. In March 2002, 8 years after Trellis's murder, the city of Houston renamed a basketball court in her honor. The courts located at Bricker Park in Houston were renamed the Trellis Sykes Pavilion. Both the mayor of Houston at the time, Lee Brown, and the chief of police attended the dedication ceremony, along with at least 100 of Trellis's family and friends. It was a bittersweet moment for them. They were honored that Trellis was not being forgotten, but in those 8 years, no one had been caught and justice had not been served. In 2013, almost 20 years after Trellis's murder, the Houston Police Department thought that they may get a much-needed break in the decades-old murder. When it was discovered back in 1994 that 11 other women and girls had been raped, Detectives working Trellis's case learned that the DNA had been taken from the victims. However, a backlog in the state's crime lab meant that none of these rape kits were ever tested. Not until 20 years later, in 2013, when finally the backlog was cleared and the kits were tested. And in 10 of the 11 victims, they found the DNA for one person, a man named Herman Whitfield. Whitfield was arrested in 2015 and agreed to plead guilty to 4 of the sexual assaults and was given 4 life sentences. The DNA that was found on Trellis was tested against Whitfield, but it wasn't a match. Detectives, however, say that he is a person of interest in Trellis's murder, and they believe that he is responsible for at least 21 rapes between 1992 and 2008. Quote, when we saw the map of these close clusters and all of these locations where these sexual assaults occurred, and Trellis is almost in the middle during the same time period, there's too many coincidences for us to believe that it was someone else, a Houston sex crimes detective told ABC 13. In 2022, ABC 13 reporter Courtney Fisher went to speak to Whitfield in prison. He refused to go into details about the crimes he pled guilty to, and he denied having any information about Trellis's murder. But although Houston PD has been unable to link Whitfield to Trellis's murder, they said back in 2022 that they were resubmitting evidence from the crime scene to be tested. But as of today, there's been no additional information about Trellis's case, and it's not clear if the results from the resubmitted evidence has come back. It's now been 30 years since 16-year-old Trellis Sykes was brutally murdered on her way to school, and for her family and friends, the loss is just as raw as it was back then. They have done all they could to hold on in the wake of this tragedy, but the years have been hard for them. At 16, Trellis had her whole life ahead of her. She was smart, she was kind, she was an amazing athlete. She had so much promise. What kind of monster rapes and kills a girl walking to school? What kind of evil does that? It's sad to think that the person who did this has gotten away with it for 30 long years, but hopefully, with the advancement in technology, investigators will be able to link someone to this murder and finally bring closure to this family. But there is also likely someone out there that knows something. And if you do, it's time to come forward and tell the police what you know. Trellis's murder still haunts the Sunnyside community in Houston, and it will forever be a scar on the hearts of those who loved her. That's why telling Trellis's story is important. Like all unsolved murders, her case deserves our attention. Her case needs to be elevated so that more people know what happened to Trellis. Trellis Sykes was murdered on May 13th, 1994, in the Sunnyside area of Houston, Texas. Her body was found in an abandoned lot that she used as a shortcut to school. She was only 16 years old at the time. If you have any information about Trellis's murder, please contact the Houston Police Department. May Trellis Sykes rest in peace. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Threads.